Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. In this video, we'll take a quick look at how to descend when you're flying an instrument approach with no vertical guidance. A high percentage of the instrument approaches in the world are either RNAV approaches that have a GPS-generated glide path for you to follow, or ILS approaches that have a ground-based glide slope for you to follow. Descending on these approaches is pretty easy. You intercept the glide slope or glide path from the appropriate intercept altitude and then use the appropriate descent rate to track the glide slope or glide path to your decision altitude. But there are some instrument approaches that don't have any vertical guidance. These include localizer approaches, localizer backcourse approaches, simplified directional facility or SDF approaches, although there's only one of these left in the United States, VOR approaches, and NDB approaches. There are also some LDA approaches that do not have a glide slope, so they do not have vertical guidance. And then in the real world, there are some LNAV approach or RNAV approaches that are LNAV only, that don't have any sort of vertical guidance. But in Flight Sim, it looks like all the LNAV approaches have been converted to LNAV plus V approaches, so they do have advisory vertical guidance in Flight Simulator. On approaches that don't have vertical guidance, you start your descent at the final approach fix, a geographical point marked by a Maltese cross on the profile view of the chart. Instead of having a decision altitude, you have a minimum descent altitude, or MDA. And instead of executing your missed approach at a decision altitude, you fly to a missed approach point, or MAP, which is also a geographical point rather than an altitude, usually the runway threshold on a straight-in approach. While not as common as approaches with vertical guidance, these types of approaches are not necessarily uncommon, and in some cases they may be the best approach to the airport at which you wish to land. But how do you descend on these approaches when there is no glide slope or glide path for you to follow? There are two different methods you can use. The older, more traditional method is sometimes referred to as the dive and drive method. With this method, you hit your final approach fix and then descend, usually fairly quickly and often in an idle power descent in a light aircraft, to your MDA. You then fly level at the MDA until you either get visual contact with the runway and descend to a landing, or you reach your missed approach point, at which point you execute your missed approach. This method does get you under the clouds more quickly, but it also involves flying at a low altitude for a longer period of time and involves making more large power and pitch changes than you would make on a precision approach, particularly on approaches with multiple step-down fixes. The second method goes by many names, but the FAA refers to it as the Continuous Descent Final Approach, or CDFA. With this method, you descend gradually from the final approach fix like you would on an approach with vertical guidance. You use a targeted descent rate that will keep you on the appropriate descent angle for the approach, and then cross-check your altitude with geographical points along the way to make sure you're staying on the descent angle you want to maintain. You also calculate what's called a derived decision altitude, or DDA, at which you will either continue to a visual landing or execute the missed approach procedure. This method provides a more stable approach as it doesn't require you to level off at the MDA. You only need to make a large change in pitch and power once on the final approach segment at the final approach fix. So let's take a look at how we would prepare for and execute a continuous descent final approach, or CDFA. So here are the steps that you need to use when you're preparing to conduct one of these continuous descent final approaches, or CDFA approaches. First, you need to determine the visual descent angle, or VDA, for the approach. Then you need to determine your target descent rate for that VDA. Then you need to calculate your derived decision altitude, or DDA. Then you want to calculate descent cross checkpoints. And then finally, you want to adjust your descent as needed based on your altitude at those cross checkpoints. Let's take a look at each of these steps in detail. First, you want to find the visual descent angle, or VDA, for the approach. This is located on the plan view of the chart. Usually it's fairly close to the final approach fix. You can tell it is a VDA by seeing that it has a 3-digit number. You'll have a digit, a decimal point, and then 2 more digits, and then you'll have the little angle symbol, or excuse me, the degree symbol after that, and then this little angle symbol right here is what tells you that this is a VDA and not a glide slope or a glide path. Just like a glide slope path or excuse me, a glide slope angle or a glide path angle, it will have a threshold crossing height or TCH underneath it. And this is if you stay on that visual descent angle, what height above the touchdown zone you're going to cross the threshold at. It looks very similar to the glide slope or glide path information from a precision approach or an approach with vertical guidance, but those will have the letters GS for glide slope or GP in front of them and no angle symbol at the end. So that's how you can tell the difference between whether you're looking at a visual descent angle, a glide slope, or a glide path. So the process for determining your target descent rate for a visual descent angle is exactly the same as it would be for determining your target descent rate on an approach with vertical guidance like an ILS. You want to go back to the FAA's climb and descent table. Again, you can find this by just Googling FAA climb descent table, or a lot of apps, flight planning apps do have it on their in their app somewhere, so you can find it there as well. So what we want to do is we want to find the vertical path angle for the approach, which we looked at earlier. And so on the approach we just pulled up earlier, it was a 3-degree angle, and most of them are going to be 3-degree angles. There are some that are higher, so always take a look at that. But we'll just assume that we have an approach with a 3-degree angle for this example. The next thing you want to look at is your ground speeds. You'll notice you have ground speeds in 60, 90, 120, all the way up to 360. Obviously, with the aircraft we're flying right now, we're going to be on the lower end of that. We fly a 70 knot approach speed in the Cessna 172. So if we average 60 and 90, that comes out to be 75 knots. So we will just use that. That's going to get us in the ballpark. So what we do there is we go down and we find the descent rates down in these tables here where the path angle and the ground speed meet. So that's going to tell you your descent rate. So we get 318 for 60 knots and 478 for 90 knots. So we average those two together and we come out with 398 feet per minute is what we need to maintain a 3-degree visual descent angle at 75 knots of ground speed. Note that this is ground speed and not indicated airspeed. So if you have a significant headwind or tailwind, you're going to need to make an adjustment there. There is a way for us to calculate our descent rate that we'll need for a 3-degree descent angle. It only works for a 3-degree descent angle, but you can calculate it. It's not quite as accurate as using the chart, but since we can only see about 100 foot per minute increments on our VSI anyway, it will get us in the ballpark for that. So let's take a look at an example. So to calculate a descent rate for a 3-degree visual descent angle, we want to multiply our ground speed by 5, or another way you can think about it, kind of a mental math way to do it, is to divide your ground speed by 2 and then multiply by 10. So either one of those methods works. So let's, for example, look at a 70 knot ground speed. That's a good mental math way, or a good mental math example. 70 divided by 2 is going to be 35, and then multiply 35 by 10. That gets you 350 feet per minute as a target descent rate when you're doing 70 knots on a 3-degree visual descent angle. So again, that's not going to be quite as accurate. For example, if we look at a 75 knot ground speed using that method, we come up with 375 feet per minute versus the chart says 398 feet per minute. So not exactly the same, but close enough to get you in the ballpark for staying on the glide slope while you're performing the approach, and then cross-checking and making adjustments. So the next thing we want to do is calculate our derived decision altitude, or DDA, and that's very simple. You just add 50 feet to your MDA for that approach, and then you will actually use this altitude like a decision altitude. So you'll fly your target descent rate until you get to this DDA, and then once you get to the DDA, you will go ahead and miss the approach. So for this approach, we're looking at the localizer runway 16 into Drake Field in Fayetteville, Arkansas. The minimums for Cat A and B aircraft, the MDA is going to be 1,780 feet, and so we just add 50 to that, and we come up with a DDA of 1830. And we're going to treat this, again, like a decision altitude. This is the minimum we're going to bug on our minimum bug if we have that available to us in the aircraft we're using. So we're not going to bug 1780, we'll bug 1830. So that will be the minimums we use for this approach. So the next thing we want to do is calculate some descent cross-check points. And this is so that we can keep an eye on the descent as we come down to make sure that our target descent rate is working out and that we're not too high and not too low. So what we want to do is calculate what altitude the aircraft should be. Initially, we're going to do this above the threshold crossing height, or TCH, for each mile starting at the runway threshold and moving back to the final approach fix. And again, we're going to use the FAA's climb and descent table for this. And it tells us that if we are using a 3-degree visual descent angle, like we've been talking about so far, that we're going to be 318 feet above the threshold crossing height for each mile we are away from the runway. So to look at how this works out mile by mile, at the runway threshold, we will be at the threshold crossing height. At 1 mile above the runway, or 1 mile from the runway, we will be 318 feet above the threshold crossing height. At 2 miles from the runway, we'll be an additional 318 feet above threshold crossing height, so 636 feet above the TCH. At 3 miles, again, another 318 feet higher, so 954 feet above the threshold crossing height. And that works out to be 1272 at 4 miles and 1590 at 5 miles. So that tells us how high above the threshold crossing height we should be at those distances away from the runway. But the important thing to us is what our altimeter should be reading at those points. So to determine that, we need to do a little more math. First, we need to know how high we're going to cross the threshold at, what the threshold crossing height is going to be. So for that, we look at our chart. We're going to use that example of the localizer in the runway 16 at Drake Field in Fayetteville, Arkansas again. Underneath our visual descent angle, it tells us that the threshold crossing height is 50 feet. So when we cross the runway threshold, we should be 50 feet above the touchdown zone elevation. It also tells us at the top of the chart that the touchdown zone elevation for this field is 1252 for runway 16. So for crossing the runway threshold, which is 1252, 50 feet above that, our altimeter should read 1302. As we cross the runway threshold if we're on that visual descent angle. Just add 50 feet to 1252 and you come up with that. So what does this mean for our altimeter as we move from the threshold back towards the final approach fix? All we need to do is add 318 feet per mile as we move away from the threshold. So if we're 1 mile away from the threshold, we add 318 feet to that threshold crossing height, or the threshold crossing altitude of 1302. We come up with 1620. So that's what our altimeter should say if we're 1 mile away from the threshold. At 2 miles away from the threshold, it should read another 318 feet higher from that, a total of 636 feet. Add that to your threshold crossing altitude, you come up with 1,938 feet. And 3 miles from that, you're going to add 954 to your threshold crossing height. So 2256 is what your altimeter should read when you're 3 miles away from the threshold crossing height. And we don't need to calculate any further back from that because the final approach fix here is located 3.8 miles from the runway threshold. So calculating what our height should be at 4 miles is not going to be helpful because we're going to be at that platform altitude and not have started our descent yet. Now, if you're flying a GPS approach or an RNAV approach where you have the distance from the runway displayed in front of you, you could stop there. But unfortunately, at this approach, we do not get a display of the arc distance from the runway. We have to use DME to determine where we are on the approach, and this chart tells us that the runway threshold is actually located at 1.2 DME. And the reason for this is that the localizer transmitter is at the far end of the runway pointing this way, and it's a 6,000-foot runway, which is equal to about 1.2 DME. So when you get to this point, your DME is going to be indicating 1.2 because that's how far away it is from the transmitter. Pretty simple fix. All we have to do to figure out where this 1, 2, and 3 mile point is in terms of our DME indication is add that 1.2 miles to these numbers here. So our DME distances for the 1 mile point will be 2.2 DME. The 2 mile point will be 3.2 DME, and the 3 mile point will be 4.2 DME. So as we hit our final approach fix at 2,500 feet and start our descent, that will indicate 5 DME. Again, that's 3.8 miles from the runway. When we get to 4.2 DME away from the runway, we're 3 miles away from the threshold. We should see an altitude of about 2256. When we get to 3.2 DME, that's our 2 DME point, so 1938. And then 2.2 DME is 1 mile away from the runway, and 1620 should be our altitude. You'll notice that that is going to be below the MDA, so we should have gotten the runway in sight prior to that point. And the last thing you want to do is adjust your descent rate. So if you arrive at 4.2 DME and you're still at 2,400 feet, then you're a little high on your VTOL's descent path, and you need to increase your rate of descent. If you arrive at 4.2 DME and you're at 2,000 feet, then you're a little low, and you need to shallow up that descent rate, and then keep cross-checking as you head down and make adjustments to that descent rate, just like you would do on an ILS. Using a CDFA descent may not always be the best option depending on the conditions at the field and the approach. One example where this would not be the case would be if you're approaching the airport and they do actually have, you'll notice the visibility listed for the airport here is 3/4 of a mile. That's the minimum visibility we need to be able to descend from the DDA to a landing and the minimum to shoot the approach. But if you look at our DDA here, it's going to be 1,830 feet on our altimeter. That's going to be about 580 feet above the ground. So the point at which we reach that DDA on our visual descent angle is going to be about a little over 1.5 miles away from the runway. So if we're 1.5 miles away from the runway when we reach our DDA, we are most likely not going to see the field if the visibility is actually 3/4 of a mile. In cases like that, instead of doing a CDFA approach, it may be more advantageous to do the traditional dive and drive, where you descend down to your MDA or an MDA with a buffer, and then fly level out to your missed approach point, and then hopefully when you get 3/4 of a mile away from the field or a little further, then you can pick up the approach lights and descend on in, and you can be able to get into the field that way. You can also do a modified CDFA where you descend at a at the rate that you need to maintain that visual descent angle and go ahead and cross-check that. But once you get to your DDA, you go ahead and level off at the DDA and then fly forward at the DDA until you get to that missed approach point, in this case 1.2 nautical miles. The only thing that you need to be aware of if you're using this procedure, and you should be aware of it if you're doing a dive and drive type approach as well, is that if you get, say 1/2 mile or fairly close to the runway threshold, and you don't get the runway environment or the approach lights picked up until you're very close to the runway threshold, you may at that point be too high to make a normal descent to landing, to make a safe descent to landing from that position. So even though you get the airport environment in sight, it may not be safe to continue to a visual landing at that point. You may be too high. There is a tool that approach designers put into approaches without vertical guidance that will help you to determine if you may be possibly too high or too close to the runway to initiate a safe descent, even if you get the runway environment in sight, and that is called the visual descent point. A visual descent point is marked on the chart with a big black V, and it is defined as a point on the final approach course of a non-precision approach, or probably more accurately, an approach without vertical guidance, from which a normal descent from the MDA or DDA to the runway touchdown point may be commenced. And all that this tells you is that flying beyond the VDP at your MDA or your DDA may result in the aircraft being too high to make a normal descent to a landing. In other words, You may need to go missed if you fly much past the VDP. Even if you get the runway environment in sight, you may be too high. So it's just a tool to tell you where you are in relation to where you would normally start your descent. So looking at our example approach, this localizer to runway 6 into Drake Field in Fayetteville, Arkansas, the VDP is at 2.7 DME, so this is where we would arrive approximately at our DDA of 1830 feet. And normally, if we get the runway in sight at this point, we just continue a normal descent down to a normal landing. But if we don't get the airport in sight, again, we could level off at our DDA or even our MDA and fly forward till we get to the missed approach point. But if we get much past 2.7 nautical miles and we're going towards the transmitter, so the DME is going to count down, the further away we get from this, the lower the number gets, and the closer we get to this number, the less likely it is that we are going to be in a position to where we could make that safe descent to landing, and the more likely it is that we're going to be too high to make that descent, even if we get the runway environment in sight. So another time that you would not want to use a CDFA type descent is when you are doing a circling approach. If the runway that you're landing at is not aligned with the approach course that you're coming in on, and you're going to have to maneuver at MDA anyway, you're going to have to level anyway, so there's no point in doing a continuous descent that you can't continue the descent from, since you're going to have to level and do that circling maneuver at MDA anyway. So circling approaches generally are approaches that you do not want to use a CDFA technique with. You generally want to do a dive and drive, get on down to your MDA or your MDA with a buffer so that you have plenty of time to try to get the field in sight and start your maneuver to circle as soon as you can. So that concludes this video. We'll be demonstrating some practical in-flight examples of how to use the CDFA technique in the videos and lessons on the approach types that you can use them on. So stay tuned for those. In the meantime, if you've enjoyed the content, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell, and share the content with folks you think might enjoy it as well. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.